Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, and Philippa Boyens took many creative liberties while adapting Tolkien's original work to the silver screen, most of which was unavoidable, like the 17-year gap between Bilbo's party and when Gandalf returns to the Shire, the hobbits meeting Tom Bombadil, and much, much more. In this series, my plan was to go scene by scene in Jackson's Lord of the Rings film trilogy and compare it to Tolkien's original work, but this is where we run into an issue. You see, the next few scenes in the Fellowship of the Ring show Sam and Frodo leaving the Shire, running into Merry and Pippin, and then heading to the Prancing Pony and Bree while trying to avoid the Black Riders. These scenes only take about 15 to 20 minutes in the films, but Tolkien devotes 6 whole chapters to the events that transpire from the time Frodo leaves Bag End to when the 4 hobbits make it to Bree. And if you know anything about Tolkien, 6 chapters is essentially a whole trilogy on its own. Needless to say, there are many things that Peter Jackson and his team decided to omit when creating their films, and probably for good reason, but I'll leave that up to you. So, this week and probably the next couple episodes of my series Movies vs. Manuscripts might not be so much an analysis of the scenes, but more so an essay on what you are missing if you've only watched the films. Today, we're going to be diving into everything that happens from the time Gandalf and Frodo have their conversation about the One Ring until the time that the 4 hobbits get on Bucklebury Ferry. This covers chapters 3 and 4 of Tolkien's Fellowship of the Ring. I'll still be comparing the scenes to Tolkien's writings, but next week's episode will most likely only be about Tolkien's writings, as there is no film counterpart to those chapters in the Fellowship of the Ring. Just a reminder, this is a celebration of both the films and Tolkien's work. This series gives everyone a chance to dive into the vast lore of Middle-earth and nerd out about cool facts and snippets of the story that we miss in the films. But at the end of the day, Peter Jackson and his team still created one of the greatest film trilogies of all time. So that being said, let's dive right in. Per usual, let's kick things off by briefly reviewing what happens in these scenes of the Fellowship of the Ring. This week, we'll be taking a look at 5 different scenes. To start, we have the moment that Gandalf, Frodo, and Sam set out on their adventure from the Shire. While they're still in Shire territory, Gandalf departs after telling Frodo to never put the ring on. Frodo and Sam continue their journey, and while cooking up a meal in the woods, they see elves heading west and singing. Watching from a distance, Frodo says that they're leaving Middle-earth never to return. Afterwards, we cut to Gandalf riding to Orthanc, where Saruman the White resides. Gandalf seeks his counsel in regards to the One Ring, but Saruman turns on him, and after Gandalf refuses to come to the side of Sauron, they fight and Gandalf gets trapped on the top of the tower. We then cut back to Frodo and Sam on their hike, and Sam loses Frodo in the cornfields, only to find him and tell him that he promised Gandalf he wouldn't lose Frodo. At this moment, Merry and Pippin run into them, as they have just stolen some crop from Farmer Maggot, who is now pursuing them with his dogs. The 4 hobbits make a run for it and fall down a cliffside, only for Frodo to realize that they're now on a main road and a Black Rider is coming towards them. After narrowly escaping the rider, the hobbits make a run for Bucklebury Ferry and nearly get caught by multiple other riders. They barely make it to the ferry, with Frodo jumping on last second, which keeps the Black Riders at bay for the time being. And that is where these scenes end off for us this week. I have to warn you that before we get into our 4 categories of characters, timeline, location, and plot, that there are quite a few changes. So stick with me as we begin by breaking down which characters we see in the scenes and which ones are in Tolkien's work but not included in the films. First, the characters we see are Frodo and Sam, Gandalf and Saruman, Merry and Pippin, and we hear the voice of Farmer Maggot chasing the hobbits. Also, we see a few Nazgul. The characters that Tolkien writes about but are not included in the films are Folko Boffin, Fatty Bolger, Farmer Maggot's wife and children, Lobelia Sackville Baggins and her son Lotho, Radagast the Brown, and lastly, Gildor and Glorion. We'll get into all these extra characters' involvement once we head into the plot changes for these scenes, but a quick side note, Radagast is included because we have to do some chapter hopping here, since Jackson included Gandalf and Saruman's encounter in these scenes instead of recounting them during the Council of Elrond, as Tolkien describes in the book. But we'll get into that in just a minute. Before we do, let's address the timeline and location differences. As we already discussed in last week's episode, there was a 17-year gap between Bilbo's party and Gandalf returning to the Shire, which would make Frodo nearly 50 years old at that time. After discussing the ring with Gandalf and deciding that he should leave the Shire and head to Rivendell, Frodo procrastinates his departure by a few more months. We'll get into this plot change later, but as for the timeline, Frodo doesn't end up leaving the Shire until the day after his 50th birthday, which was September 23rd of 3rd Age 3018, whereas the films show Frodo, Sam, and Gandalf essentially leaving that next morning after their conversation in Bag End. As for location changes, the films completely leave out their stop at Farmer Maggot's house. Also, Frodo does not purchase a home in Crickhollow, so therefore there's no mention of that location. And additionally, in the books, Frodo's original plan was to head to Rivendell, not the Prancing Pony in Bree. It is only after a series of events in Tolkien's writings that the four hobbits end up in Bree, but that was not Frodo's original intent. All in all, I believe these are the only changes made to the location and timeline of these scenes. Yes, Peter Jackson did jumble around the time when we learn of Gandalf's trip to Orthanc, but technically it would have happened around this time anyway, so in my opinion, it works out for us to see this event in real time instead of hearing about it later from Gandalf. Okay, so buckle up because we're about to head into the plot changes. And as always, I'll try to do this in chronological order, but due to the massive amount that's missing from Peter Jackson's adaptation of these events, this may end up being more of a summary of the chapters than a comparison to the scenes. Either way, you're about to learn a whole lot about what actually happens after Gandalf and Frodo confirm the One Ring in the fire at Bag End. So let's rewind and start from that moment. As mentioned last week, we have the moment with Sam being found eavesdropping and Gandalf assigning him to the journey. But in the next chapter, we jump to a couple months later when Frodo is still at Bag End. Gandalf has stayed with him and they have a conversation as Gandalf encourages him to leave sooner than later, but Frodo says he doesn't want to look suspicious. So what he does is he sells Bag End and he arranges to purchase a home in a part of the Shire called Crickhollow, which is in Buckland. He tells Gandalf that this plan helps him leaving the Shire seem less conspicuous, and Frodo himself even spreads the rumor around Hobbiton that he has lost all Bilbo's money and needs to live with family now. Which this is important because Gandalf and Frodo don't want to draw the attention of those searching for the ring, and Frodo is one of the wealthiest and most prosperous hobbits in Hobbiton and even the whole Shire. For him to just leave everything would seem strange to all the other hobbits and the gossip would spread throughout the land. So by spreading this rumor, he is really covering all his bases. He even sells Bag End to the Sackville Bagginses who have been after the estate for decades. All that being said, the first major change is that Frodo takes until many months later on his 50th birthday to officially pack up and then leave Bag End, whereas the films portray him and Sam as leaving the next morning. Additionally, Gandalf does not depart from them during their journey, but rather before they leave. A couple months into Gandalf being at the Shire, Radagast visits him with the news and summons from Saruman. This prompts Gandalf to leave Frodo in June of that year, and he tells Frodo that he'll return by his birthday on September 22nd. Frodo's intention was not to leave without him, but due to Gandalf's delay, he ends up leaving on the 23rd. And since we just mentioned it, we might as well address the changes in regards to Saruman and Gandalf's meeting. First, Saruman in the books refers to himself as Saruman the Ringmaker and Saruman of Many Colors, which showcases his arrogance and superiority complex above Gandalf and even Sauron himself. Also, Gandalf and Saruman do not have a fight in the books, rather Gandalf just gets imprisoned at Orthanc. Because of Radagast's involvement, however, Gandalf is freed by hitching a ride on Gwaihir, the King of the Eagles. This is because when Radagast and Gandalf met, Radagast told Gandalf that he would send his allies to keep an eye on things. Because he notified the Eagles where Gandalf went, Gandalf had an escape plan without even knowing it. Alright, so now that we've covered that, we need to mention some of these missing characters. First, let me give a brief mention to Lobelia and her son Lotho. They show up the night of Frodo's 50th birthday to claim Bag End, but Frodo promptly kicks them out as he tells them that they don't actually acquire it until he leaves on the next day. Frodo's friends, Folco Boffin and Fatty Bulger, help to pack things up along with Sam, Merry, and Pippin. And Merry and Fatty even go ahead of the group to Crickhollow to set up the home with Frodo's belongings. This leaves Sam, Frodo, and Pippin to head out on their journey to Crickhollow, instead of just Sam and Frodo as portrayed in the movies. It's also key to note that Sam is the only one that knows of the true plot behind Frodo's departure. Merry and Pippin, at this point, don't know why Frodo is leaving. After Gandalf does not show up when he said he would, Frodo stays a little longer before departing with Sam and Pippin. Next, we come to the first encounter with a Black Rider. This encounter is only with the three hobbits that are previously mentioned, as Merry is not with them yet. After this close call, Sam fills Frodo in on a conversation that his gaffer had with a strange person before they left, because Sam believes that this Black Rider is the same figure that his father had a conversation with. Frodo also witnessed this conversation, but only by listening to it while on a walk. The gaffer was questioned by an odd figure about where Baggins is heading, and the gaffer tells him Crickhollow as this is public information. This raises the concern of Frodo, as he now knows that the riders know where he's heading. After this, the three hobbits have another close call with a Black Rider who almost finds them, but before he can, a group of singing elves comes along in the woods and the rider is scared off. This would be the parallel to the scene of Sam and Frodo witnessing the passing of the elves in the woods. But here's the major change. In the book, the three hobbits go up to the elf at the back of the procession, and he recognizes Frodo. We learn that this is Gildor and Glorion, and he dubs Frodo Elf Friend after Frodo speaks some Elvish to him, which he learned from Bilbo. Gildor seems to be vaguely aware of Frodo's omission, and after the hobbits share some news of the Black Riders that are chasing them, Gildor allows them to stay with the elves that night. They eat and drink and talk, and then they go to sleep only to wake up to the elves being gone, but breakfast being ready for them as well as their supplies filled with elven drink. And this is where we head into chapter 4 of Tolkien's text. So the next notable change is that Sam does make a promise to not lose or leave Frodo, just like in the movies, but not to Gandalf. The next day, after being with the elves, Frodo learns that Sam told the elves he would follow Frodo to the moon if he needs to. So instead of Gandalf making Sam commit to this, it's actually the elves. Also, a tiny theme shift is that Tolkien writes that Frodo wakes up the next morning with a knot in his back from where a big tree root was during his sleep. I think they altered this slightly and gave the lines to Sam when Sam tells Frodo that he can't sleep because everywhere he turns, he's got a big dirty great tree root stuck in his back. So now we come to another part of Tolkien's writings that Peter Jackson completely removed from the films, which is Farmer Maggot's involvement. Farmer Maggot in the films isn't even given a face, but rather we just hear him chasing Merry and Pippin, who stole his crops. And this is the first notable change from this section. After a long travel, Frodo, Sam, and Pippin come upon Farmer Maggot's land, and Frodo is scared by this because he hasn't set foot on Maggot's property in nearly 30 years. As it turns out, in Tolkien's version of events, Merry and Pippin, specifically Merry, are actually quite friendly and close with Farmer Maggot, and it is actually Frodo who used to steal mushrooms from him in his childhood. The last occasion of which Farmer Maggot beat Frodo and showed him to his dogs, saying that if he ever stole from him again, his dogs would eat him. This event petrified Frodo and kept him from ever going back to the farm, and even made him scared to go up to Farmer Maggot while running from the Black Riders. But eventually, after Pippin convinces him that it's fine, they approach the farmhouse and Maggot brings them inside and fills them in on an encounter he had with a Black Rider, which we discussed in last week's episode. Long story short, a Black Rider came and asked him about Baggins, and Farmer Maggot told him to leave his property or else he would sick his dogs on the rider, which caused the Nazgul to turn and run. This news frightens Frodo so much that he wants to leave immediately to head for Bucklebury Ferry, which is their ticket to get to Crickhollow. But Maggot insists that they stay for dinner and says he will take them by wagon to the ferry, which will save them time and provide safety. They agree, and afterwards they eat dinner with Maggot and his family and then leave to the ferry. Upon arrival, Farmer Maggot gives them a basket of goods that his wife packed for the three hobbits, and then they hear footsteps coming down the road. After hiding Frodo, they find out that it's just Merry coming to see what has kept them so long. The four hobbits say goodbye to Maggot and then get on the ferry without a chase from the Black Riders. Although, upon leaving the dock, they look back to see a rider coming along the road searching for them. Narrowly avoiding this rider, they continue down the river until their destination, but we'll get to that in the next episode, because that finishes off chapter 4 of Tolkien's writings, and completes the final scene of this week's episode. Like I said, next week's episode will go into some chapters that are completely left out of the films, as the next scenes in Peter Jackson's Fellowship of the Ring are at the Prancing Pony. But as for the changes in this week's scenes, I think that all in all, Peter Jackson and his team of writers made the right choices for the adaptation. First, to develop a character like Farmer Maggot, we would need a lot more time, and that goes for including characters like the Sackville Bagginses and Folko and Fatty. The reason why Merry and Pippin are included, but Folko and Fatty aren't, is because Merry and Pippin are integral to the overall plot of the trilogy. You just can't remove them. But to include Folko and Fatty, as well as the side plot of the Sackville Bagginses coming to claim Bag End only to be kicked out, would give off more of a sitcom writer's vibe with an A story and a B story per episode. For an epic trilogy, even one that is nearly 4 hours long per film, you just can't include some of these extra details. This includes changes like having Merry and Pippin stealing from Farmer Maggot instead of Frodo. In the films, we need to see each character and their complete story arc, and having Merry and Pippin start off as the goofballs gives us way more of an epic transformation. So in my opinion, all of these changes and alterations get a 5 out of 5. And that wraps up this week's episode of Movies vs. Manuscripts. If you enjoyed, be sure to like and subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss next week's video. Comment below if I missed any crucial changes or alterations, and as always, have a great week and see you in the next episode.